Hey, I've got an idea. Let's make a jewelry organizer. Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'm Sarah from Ugly Duckling House, and I'm currently cramped in my master bedroom hallway to show you my latest project. This is my DIY jewelry organizer that I made custom for me because I have so many earrings and I just really needed a place to put them all that wasn't in a drawer where they could get tangled or for the fringe to get kind of nasty. Easily the coolest thing about this project to me is that the stud earring holder is magnetic. That means that I don't actually have to take the jewelry holder down in any way to remove the backing from each of the studs. I began by cutting down a 1/4-inch piece of walnut plywood. This was considerably cheaper than buying a 3/4-inch thick piece of walnut, but it definitely added to the challenge. First, I tried a previous method I've used to prevent splintering by taping my cut line. This proved to be more of a nuisance and splintered anyway. So then I tried cutting the back of the plywood and was much more successful. I cut this down further into a large piece for the main section of the organizer, a smaller cut for the shelf, and a third for the stud earring holder. I was able to use the small scrap this created to test out how my sander would react to the plywood edge. I needed the main section to be thick enough to hold some brass rods and a shelf, so I grabbed a few pieces of scrap wood and glued them to the back of everything except for the stud earring holder piece. As you can see, I left a large section of the main piece with no reinforcement, which would allow for earrings to hook into once those holes were drilled. In hindsight, my scrap was a little warped, and I think it would be better to select a single backing piece to stay flatter, and cut out the earring section with a jigsaw, so the plans available on my website already reflect that change. I've been really inspired by clean, rounded shapes lately, but I don't have any corner radius templates, so I did the next best thing. I also measured my cuts and printed 2 separate drill guides. The larger earring holes would be spaced 1 inch apart, while the stud earrings would be 1/2 inch. I wasn't confident that using spray adhesive on this would be wise since I wouldn't be able to sand down very far on the plywood if any glue residue remained. So I found some double-sided tape used for photos and used it in several places to keep my guide secure. I've heard carpet tape works the same, but use what you got, right? Then of course is all the drilling. I do have an old drill press from my dad, but my lack of patience for finding my lost chuck key resulted in me just using my drill. To decrease the amount of tear out, I clamped some scrap on the bottom and it worked extremely well. But looking back, I would have flipped the walnut piece over and drilled from the back to the front through the scrap wood, and it would have been cleaner. Still, I was very excited to peel off the guide. I used my new benchtop sander for getting the corners on each piece, starting with the thinnest component just in case I had to recut it. I mentioned that I had a scrap piece to use for testing the sander before my next step, so by doing that, I'd already learned that my disc sander would lead to a lot of splintering on this plywood thickness, and opting to use my belt sander instead worked like a charm. The glued up section, however, I tried first on the belt sander before giving the disc sander another try. It worked great, but I was careful to try and always sand with the grain as much as possible. Just as the larger earring section on the main piece needed some negative space in the back for earring hooks, the stud earring holder also needed to come off of the organizer by just a little bit to account for the backs of the stud earrings. I found my solution was to hand cut some 1/2-inch dowels with a pole saw and sand the faces and glue that to the back of the holder. You'll notice my fingers getting pretty close to that moving belt on the sander, and while I was cautious and didn't get injured trying to sand them down, I did grate the end of my thumbnail when I attempted to do the same with brass cuts later on. So in the interest of trying to pass on lessons learned, I think it's definitely better to use something that can hold these small pieces for you while sanding and prevent more chance of injury. While waiting for the glue to dry, I drilled the rest of the holes for the back piece, starting with the larger earring section and again with a printed grid so I knew where to drill through. I also drilled a little over halfway through for the brass rods at the bottom, and at the top, I drilled all the way through with a smaller bit and about halfway through on the back with a larger bit. This leaves a recessed area to hold the knot from the stretch cord. Once the glue on the earring holder was dry, I drilled in the back of each dowel to glue in the magnets. I measured and then repeated this placement on the organizer. Be sure to double check the polarity before gluing so that it attracts rather than repels. To finish off the edges and make it look like a more solid walnut piece,
I used edge banding. I did the same with the shelf piece and trimmed the excess. I found that getting the edge banding around the corners was a little tricky, so it took a little bit extra time to warm up those sections and get the wood kind of pliable before bending, so it didn't have as much of a chance to crack. This was my first project using brass rods, and one of my main pieces arrived tarnished, so I'll add a little quick tip video separate from this one to show you how I removed that. But it was pretty straightforward to cut each brass piece with a metal cutting wheel on my angle grinder. And note to self, a vise would not be a bad addition to my workshop. Next came sanding the brass rod ends that were cut, sanding the final piece, gluing the brass rods into place, and a little excess glue cleanup from the edge banding. Then it was ready to oil. I've been meaning to try Maker brand Simple Finish and was really excited to try it out on this piece. Like a dope, I forgot my gloves on the start of the first coat, but remembered them on the second. I just couldn't cut the footage of that oil going on though. One of the last pieces to install was the stretch cord at the top. Most of the available cord I could find was really thin, so I hacked it by grabbing this pack of rubber necklaces and triple knotting the cut ends in that recessed hole I showed you earlier. A little dab of glue on the knot will keep it from unraveling. I finished off the edge of the stud earring holder with some brown craft paint and hung the organizer on the wall. And speaking of glue, I used an extra strength craft glue for the magnets that I've used before on magnet related projects. It's plenty strong, but also a little bit rubbery, which proved to be a little too flexible for the brass rods. So just as a tip, it was easily fixed with some super glue.
That's going to be it for this tutorial. I think we covered a lot of ground and I hope you guys learned a lot right along with me. One of the things that I think I could do differently to improve this in the future, and for any of you who attempt it, is to make these holes a little bit larger for the long dangling earrings. The main reason why is that although these account for most of the earrings that I have with kind of a rubberized backing, they don't really account for some of the other more elaborate types of jewelry. Now, I included a stretch cord at the top to help deal with any kind of the outliers, but again, I think that just drilling a slightly larger hole for these types of earrings will be better than the small ones that I picked. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, as well as hitting that bell for notifications so that you know when I have a new video coming up. You can find plans for this project as well as many others on my blog at uglyducklinghouse.com. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.